Welcome. This is Soothing Whispers ASMR. As always, if there are any sounds or words you would like to hear me perform, please leave them below in the comments. Tonight, I thought we could enjoy some additional Chinese fables. I've personally never read these before, and I'm enjoying learning about stories and traditions that are different from the ones I grew up with. This is the fable of the Seagull and Kindness. In an old kingdom, there lived a wealthy and powerful man who loved seagulls. Every morning he'd get up and look at the sea, which was near his mansion. He would contemplate those white birds that amazed him for hours. One day he found a seagull on the terrace. He was quite shocked and ran over to look at it. The man saw that it was wounded. He took it in his arms and ordered his doctors to heal it. The wound wasn't very deep, and the seagull recovered pretty quickly. The man was ecstatic. The seagull amazed him so much that he decided to entertain it. He ordered people to prepare the best foods for it: pheasant, exotic meats, delicious fruits, and all kinds of delicacies. However, the seagull didn't eat anything. The man tried to make it eat the food, but it just wouldn't. 3 days passed, and consequently, the seagull died. So that was not a pretty fable at all. The moral apparently is supposed to be that sometimes love isn't really love, but just selfishness, and that really the man, had he cared about the seagull for the seagull's own sake, he would have let the seagull go rather than attempt to keep it. So I agree with the moral, but I was not expecting that fable to go in the direction that it went. Let's switch over to some sounds for a little bit, shall we? Next up, we have the man who didn't see anyone. In the ancient kingdom of Kwai, there lived a man who had an insatiable thirst for gold. Unfortunately, he was very poor, and his work didn't make him a lot of money. He barely had enough to survive. Even so, the idea of getting gold still fascinated him. The man knew that several merchants set up beautiful gold figures in their market stalls. These objects would always rest on beautiful velvet mantles. The rich men of the city would go there to observe them. They sometimes bought them, and they sometimes didn't. Suddenly, the man came up with a plan to take one of the figures that shone so brightly in the sun. One day, he put on his best clothes and ornaments and went to the market. He pretended to observe the gold figures and suddenly took one and fled. He got caught very quickly. The two guards asked him why he decided to steal those figures in broad daylight with hundreds of witnesses around. The man told them that he didn't even think about those things. He just thought of getting the gold figures, and that was it. Apparently, this fable is supposed to be a lesson about the blindness that comes with greed. However, it does make me wonder about the size of these gold figures, because gold is actually very, very heavy. So unless the figures were small or mixed with other metals to make them stronger, I don't know if the man would have been able to grab one and run. Just fun fact, gold is actually also a very soft material, which is one of the reasons that it's often mixed with other metals to give it additional firmness. So true 24 karat pure gold is very, 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 very fragile and easy to bend or otherwise malform. Fun fact for the day. And next up, if my phone will cooperate, we have The Man Who Was Obsessed with Dragons. There was a man who was obsessed with dragons. He admired their shape and the way they looked. He would get very excited when looking at pictures of them breathing fire through their mouths and killing all their enemies. The man was so obsessed with dragons that he memorized every single tale that mentioned them. He also had gigantic dragons painted all over the walls and ceiling of his house. His house looked like a temple dedicated to dragons. One night, when he least expected it, a dragon head burst through one of the windows of his house. Without giving the man time to react, the dragon began to breathe fire all over the house. Consequently, the man ran away and started screaming. Oh, I'm actually beginning to doubt whether these are genuine Chinese fables or whether they are westernized versions. The reason being that dragons in the Chinese tradition are very, very different from dragons in the Western tradition. In the Western tradition, dragons are often, they're kind of evildoers or hoarders, and they just burn things down and they breathe fire. And in the Eastern tradition, by contrast, dragons are often portrayed as being very wise and knowledgeable, and often they aren't actually associated with fire. They have different associations, but sometimes they're associated with rain or clouds or the weather, or some of them are tasked with guarding the gates of the celestial temple or are associated with the emperor's family. So clearly, before I do my next video, I need to be more careful about where I'm pulling my content from to make sure that we're getting actual Chinese fables and not potentially half westernized versions. Although China is a very, very, very old country, and frankly, civilization developed in the East frequently slightly before it did in the West. And so the difficulty with some of the Chinese fables is that many of them will have been passed down through oral tradition. And when stories get passed down through the oral tradition, a lot of times what happens is they change slightly. Because if you write it down, you know what the words are and those don't change. But if you're just remembering a story that you tell, sometimes it can make sense to remember the major strokes of the story, but kind of to change the fine details as you're telling it. And if you change the fine details for too long, then sometimes you end up with a completely different story. So it's possible that these that I just read are actually entirely Chinese fables that just came down through the ages, or it's possible that while they were coming down through the ages, they got mixed with some slightly westernized influences, and then that would explain why the dragon is, say, breathing fire and destroying a guy's house, as opposed to influencing the rain. Because again, I don't know a ton about dragons in the Chinese tradition. I just do know that they're not the malcontent evildoers that they're often portrayed as being in the West. And speaking of dragons, and with that, I fear that we have come to the end of our video. So, as always, I wish you a wonderful day and a wonderful night. Sweet dreams. Calm, relax.